Hea hate hau e wawara mai, he tiu he raki. Nāna ia mai te puputara ki he kiota, e tiki nā Aotearoa te kōtuko i te pauwhakaru katu ki te Waitemata i oku wairangi e. Te hewa mai ora. I aku nui, i aku rahi, i aku pītau whakarai, e reira mai nei i rungi o tō koutou waka, nau mai hara mai whakatau mai, nau mai ki tēnei whare o tātou, te rere atorua, nau mai. Hara mai i rungi te karanga o tēnei huihunga o tātou, hara mai, whakatau mai, kei wainganui a tātou, te pokapū a tāmaki, tuaki tēnei peka Ngāti Whātua Rāke i mehi atu ki a koutou ki tēnei wā. Tuatahi, me wahi ki te atua, kui te tīmatatanga me te whakaotinga o ngā mea katoa. Ko te tuarua, tikauna me mehi atu ki te koinga tawhito o te tau te wherowhero, roti te poka kāroa me tōna mokopuna kingi tu heitia, e no hoana ia i tā hurua tapu. Lātou ki a rātou, e kua whitirangi ki te pō, mai mahara na mātou ki a rātou, tātou ki a tātou, noho mai nei, ki tēnei ao mārama, tēnā koutou katoa. He paku tēnei, hoi no he tiki ana ki te mehi atu ki a koutou mai ngā kokanga o te motu nei, no te wai paunamu, mai ngā iwi katoa o te motu, me ngā hāpori, kamupene, wānanga, nau mai i te karanga o te rā. Nau mai te karanga o tēnei o tātou kai whakaritinga, me ngā kai ringa raupa, e whakatū tēnei kaupapa mō tātou. Kia koutou hoki, mai ngā pota coconut ao, kei te mihi kia koutou. I roti tēnā, ka huri au, tōku reo ki tōku tūpuna John Manfred Steedman, haka mara mai tātou katoa. And again, just welcome everybody. It's my privilege on behalf of the University, the Provost Chancellor Māori's Office of the Business School, Ngāti Whātua Rākei, but also on behalf of the organisers of this particular kaupapa, which I wish I had more time to hang around and listen to welcome you all here this morning and today. And just in terms of, I'm here in particular just to support and show that I'm quite interested in these sorts of things, as a lot of us Māori across the some 800 marae around the region are interested in these sorts of things. We have a number of words for energy in te reo, and they're expressing different forms of release of that energy. So, I mean, I know that's not particularly those extra realms that we're going to be talking about in this forum, but just to know that it's an important aspect of our engagements too. So, and I cast my mind back to a particular local story here in the Kaipara where there was an energy company that was looking to use the flow in and out of water into the harbour at one point in time that didn't quite go ahead. And the acknowledgement of shipwreck records that went back to the late 1800s, but of course we have a whakatauki that goes back to 900 AD that talks about the energy of that place. So my point is around those enduring partnerships, relationships, building connections with one another to learn the connection with energy in that respect with tangata whenua here, but also utilising the expertise that sits in this room and across the world. So I want to acknowledge you all in that respect. Have a great hui. I won't get you to sing, but you feel free to sing during the coffee breaks if you wish. And those of you that are speaking from overseas, if you are speaking formally as part of the forum, you do have the option to sing at the end of your speech if you wish. So you've got your preparation time now. Wēno, kanafi tēnā, as we say in this part of the country, that's enough for me. Kei te mihi kia koutou katoa. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Actually, I will sing a song. Now this song, Papaki Mai talks about a young girl's vision of watching the sea ebb and flow and all of the things that she's describing as she sees the waves curl over. And I wanted to use that for two reasons, because it's from here. It does talk about energy and practice and our acknowledgement of the ecosystem that we're a part of. And one of the words is in there is one of the words that we gifted to the latest boat, Team New Zealand, Te Rehutai, which is sea spray. The stuff that flows off the waves as it's curling over. So, Papaki mai, agaru nui, wawaratia, watairere, eripo e, ngagaru nui, te rehutai, hei ko nei rā. Kia ora tātou.
Kia ora. Thank you so much. That was a beautiful way, I think, to start our hui today. And welcome to those of you who are joining us from all around New Zealand. What a privilege to be here. I know you probably hear this over and over again, but my colleagues zooming in sometimes internationally, but that I was meeting with this week, we're very, very jealous of an in-person meeting, of a community meeting, but also just an in-person meeting. So we're very privileged in many ways to have the knowledge and practice and interest of such a wide diversity of people. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Julie Macarthur. I work in politics and international relations and public policy here at the University of Auckland, and my main area of study is public community energy and energy transitions, and how we make them not just technologically sound in terms of reducing carbon emissions, but how we actually ensure that those transitions are also just and help people thrive, not just survive. And this particular event was a brainchild of Dr. Anna Burka, who's sitting over there at the table, and Gareth Cartwright back there of the Community Energy Network. We had a somewhat similar event a couple of years ago that was smaller, and we're definitely growing, so that's very exciting. And the whole idea of it, you probably saw in the ads and the notes that we put out, was to bring together people who work in local and community energy development, expertise and researchers internationally who are working in this space, as well as people who are interested in policy making and the kind of designs and structures that can help facilitate. So the whole purpose of today is to bring together diverse groups and talk about what the potential of community energy is, and here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, what kind of specific things are there that we could be doing to showcase to the world. So we have a couple things, matters of housekeeping. There are QR code scanners, so please use those. You never know what happens, and we are in Auckland, in a hotbed of COVID in New Zealand, so please do. Use the masks when you're on the bus, use the QR scanners. The other thing I wanted to mention as well is our first panel today is all international speakers. 2 of them are pre-recorded and 2 of them are zooming in from Australia and from Canada. So there may be technical glitches, so please be patient with us as we kind of work through that through the day. We're still new to some of this. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that for our Zoom participants, they can use a chat function, but we also wanted to bring that into our room as well, because we have a really packed schedule, and we're going to try to leave time for questions and answers, but inevitably things run over a little bit. So you'll notice on each table there are some sticky notes. Every table has some, and we have a little chat board up on the white area over there. So if there are questions you have that didn't get answered, stick them up on the chat board there. We have allocated about 45 minutes at the end of the event today where we're going to talk about next steps. So the point of this meeting isn't just to talk to each other, though of course that's very valuable. It's about to try to strategize and think about what comes after. And so your questions and your input and insight is absolutely essential. Many of you could also be speakers at the forum, just as you're participating and listening. So we want this to be as interactive as possible. Our chat board is one of the ways we can do that. You can also, of course, participate in the Zoom chat. We'll try to bring those all together in our final discussion at the end of the day. But we had 3 main questions for that discussion that I want you to have kind of percolating in the back of your mind. One of them is, how do you define and what do you think community energy is? What's its potential? Another is, what kinds of activities or things do you think it could be doing differently? What kinds of policy designs do you think we need? And another is about how to build a network, how to build a movement growing forward. And these are things we're going to hear about on our very first panel today. So the first panel technically starts at 9:20, so we're almost right on time, which is a really good sign. But again, welcome from Anna and Gareth and I, and enjoy the day. Hopefully it stimulates some debate and discussion. So this is a good time, if you miss getting some tea or coffee, maybe grab it, and then we'll get the first speaker set up. And it will be a pre-recorded talk between myself and Dr. Patrick, or Professor Patrick Devine-Wright from the University of Exeter. And I did it at about 10 o'clock at night from my spare room, and so the internet is a bit it fluctuates a little bit. So just be gentle when it comes to some frozen screens and whatnot. But hopefully it sets the scene, as this whole first panel will, about how we think about community energy, how it's developed in other places, and kind of just drawing as much expertise as we can find to structure our day. So thanks very much. Grab some tea and we'll get started in just 2 seconds with the first panel. All right, everyone. So I'm having a conversation here across the world right now. So this is Professor Patrick Devine-Wright, and he's a professor in human geography at the University of Exeter, and he's joining us from the UK. And he's an expert in investigating social and psychological aspects of energy transition. So NIMBYism, public participation, community engagement, and basically what we're here to talk about in our conference and our hui today. So I thought I was going to ask him a few questions. Someone may be interested in his book, Renewable Energy in the Public, From NIMBY to Participation. And he's written really extensively and consulted with industry and governments in a number of different countries on this issue of what does community energy look like? How does community participation work? And whenever I teach or classes or talk about community energy, one of the frameworks that he talks about around outcomes versus processes is one that is really, really handy and useful. So I'm delighted that he can join us today. And Patrick, one of the first questions I wanted to ask you was, how would you define community energy? What is it? And how has it evolved since you've been studying it?
Okay, thanks, Julie, and I'm very happy to be part of this event. Well, I think the first thing to say is that community energy is a pretty tricky, ambiguous word. It's actually quite a difficult thing to define, and that's been a fairly stable characteristic of this area over the last, say, 15 years. Having said that, a few of us have tried our best to try and nail it and pin it down at times. And I think in a nutshell, if you had to define it, it would be maybe phrases like grassroots and bottom-up initiatives in the energy transition space. So, when I started studying transitions towards renewable energy technologies maybe 2 decades ago, most of the action was in the projects were tended to be large scale, and they tended to be led by private sector companies, and they tended to be directed by state regulations trying to change the energy mix in the system that we have in our countries. And in some ways, community energy has kind of arisen as an antithesis to that to some degree, in the sense that instead of talking about really large capital intensive projects led by multinational companies or consortia of companies that tend to, shall we say, cut corners with public participation or reduce them to tick box exercises. What community energy is all about is saying, well, okay, if we do have to change our energy system, if we have to decarbonize the energy sources we use, then what's the role of society in that? Is it passive people who accept things happening near where they live, or is it people who are actively involved in the process of change? And I would connect the community energy concept with another one that I and others have started using, which is the notion of energy citizenship. And if your energy citizenship kind of says that, again, it's about activity rather than passivity. Can communities be part of the process of change, transformation in energy systems and decarbonization? And then can there be lots of other benefits arising from that? Many people regard cohesive communities, active communities, communities where there are strong ties and high levels of social capital as useful ends in themselves in society. So in some senses, instead of starting with energy outcomes, maybe start with social and economic outcomes and say, well, how can the energy transition feed into those? And what might that look like? And then, what would we need to change, and what policies would need to be in place in order to tangibly enable that to happen?
Absolutely. That's really interesting. So why do you think people get involved in this in the first place? So I know some people have talked about communities already existing and then creating themselves to be part of a project as well. But what motivates people, and what are some of the benefits that come from that?
Well, the social science literature has pointed to the variety of reasons why people choose to get involved. I mean, there is obviously an environmental motivation a lot of the time. If it's a community coming together to develop a new solar project, or maybe a small scale wind turbine, or a small scale hydro project, there's clearly an environmental motive in that, in trying to reduce carbon emissions and deal with broader climate change, climate emergency issues. But the research is quite clear that people get involved for all kinds of reasons. I mean, people want to do things with others in their community. They like to feel part of a collective action. And I think the social reasons, the economic reasons, I mean, in the UK, when the policy brought in feed-in tariff mechanisms, which guaranteed an income stream to local communities, local people thought, well, some local people thought, look, this is a way we can have a guaranteed income stream from generating electricity in our backyards. And with that guaranteed income every year, we can do so many other great things with it. We can enable training. We can refurbish the village hall, which is falling down. We can support social enterprises. You know, with that guaranteed income stream, we can do so much. So I think it's a variety of reasons why people choose to get involved. It can be environmental, but it's certainly not limited to that. And often it's just about trying to be part of some kind of collective action, which has got a local benefit, but not only a local benefit, and sometimes a global benefit as well.
Do you have a sense of what kind of people, in terms of demography, tend to get, or demographics tend to support these projects? Is there a concentration in kind of one group or the other, or is it pretty broad across society?
I think, well, here it comes back to the difficulty of pinning community energy projects down. I mean, if I had to be very, very simplistic, I'd say that you can probably characterize two kinds of projects. One, which are principally focused around developing renewable energy systems and technologies, and the other, which are more about addressing fuel poverty issues, energy conservation issues. And they often have a very strong role in them, played by local authorities that have a kind of a social rationale to look after people who are struggling to pay their fuel bills and to keep their homes warm in the wintertime. So I think if you look at the renewable kind of green energy side, I think it's fairly clear now that those projects tend to be instigated by and supported by people who tend to be an older demographic that are relatively financially comfortable. They have maybe some disposable income to purchase shares in a cooperative, an energy cooperative, and they're not struggling. And I think about, for example, my own practical experience in Exeter Community Energy, where I've been on the board for the last 5 years, and I know that we have over 200 shareholders, and we've done some survey work. And these are people who are generally left-leaning, environmental, greeny types who are in their 60s and 50s, and they have a bit of money to spend. And for them, it's not really about the financial return, although they get 5% per annum on their investments. And in fact, some of them even donate their interest to our community fund pot. So I think you've got that on the renewable energy side, and some of the literature has rightfully questioned whether this is really a good thing in society, because only some communities have the capacity, the human capital, the social capital, financial capital to do this in a bottom-up way. And then on the other side, you've got efforts to try and address real difficulties with just tackling fuel poverty and home heating. And I think those kinds of initiatives are supported and participated in by people from a much broader cross-section of society, and often with a local authority input, a council input, in order to enable people who are really struggling. And of course, you do get some really successful renewable energy or energy community initiatives that do both of those things, that are and are now moving into smart energy. They're thinking about batteries, they're thinking about energy trading and peer-to-peer and all kinds of stuff around the distribution network, flexibility services. So that's the great new initiative here that's happening at the moment.
Yeah, no, that sounds really exciting. So can you explain a little bit about how that evolution happened? Was it in response to policy changes in particular, or did it just happen kind of organically as the community capacities grew or the networks grew?
It's quite clear from my reading of the last, say, 4 or 5 decades, that there have been people out there for a very long time who regard small as being beautiful and are interested in kind of alternative environmental movements. If you go back to the 70s, you've got writings and you've got activism by people who always had a problem with big tech or big companies or big state-led projects, and saw an alternative which was much more community-based or social-based. And I think about Amory Lovins's concept of a soft energy path, for example, and early work by pioneers like the Centre for Alternative Technology in the UK. So these people have been around since the 60s. They might be seen as a bit hippie-ish by some people, but their values are very different from mainstream kind of capitalism and neoliberal economics, and just kind of short-term profit, for example. So I think that has been around for a very long time. But you're absolutely right. I mean, until maybe the late 2000s, speaking about the UK now in particular, there was no policy support for this at all. They were people who were pushing against the machine and who saw themselves as opposed to the mainstream. And what's happened over the last 2 decades in the UK, at least, has been a gradual ebb and flow of policy interest at the national level in supporting this kind of development. And I'm afraid it's come, but it's gone as well. So it's a really interesting kind of historical example to look at. But basically, about 5 or 6 years ago, the Liberal Democrats, who would be maybe classed as a centre or a centre-left party, went into coalition with the Conservative government in the UK. And it was their agenda to kind of decentralise energy and to put power back with the people. Those kind of slogans that are often abused, but in the case of energy transitions might actually mean something. And they developed a community energy strategy. For the first time, the UK had a national energy policy, which was about community energy. So unfortunately, since then, the Liberal Democrats have got killed off on the polls, and their party kind of almost got wiped out. And so the policy has essentially been dormant, and it's morphed into something else. But I think that the sense I get is that there's an undercurrent of support for this across our society and many other societies for a very long time. Sometimes policy windows open and you get strong support. And often that strong support, I have to say, is very instrumental. If you look at the community energy research literature, it's not always motivated by making communities better in themselves. It's about, okay, we've got this renewable energy transition to do. Maybe if we have some really successful small-scale projects, then people will like the big stuff as well. They'll like large-scale wind farms and stuff. So it's part of a kind of a hearts and minds change campaign the policymakers have seen. And there's some evidence for that, and there's some plaudits for taking that too. But I think the kind of activists on the ground would see this as not just an instrumental means of making people like very large scale energy infrastructures, but also to be active citizens, to be participants in the energy transition, and to get all those other benefits I mentioned about local economic development, local social cohesion, all the kinds of things which could be a fantastic net benefit of community energy if it's done in the right way.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. From your research, are you aware of any particular, I mean, obviously it's context specific, but policy designs that have been more successful in helping to facilitate the development of community energy, or at least the kind of robust community energy that you were talking about at the beginning?
Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing to say is that probably every country differs in the kind of relationship it has between centralization and decentralization of the way things are governed. And not just energy, but the way everything is governed. And so, you know, to some extent, whether community energy takes off in any given societal context is going to be related to whether local authorities have got a strong role in anything in society, whether there's a lot of subsidiarity of power down to regional level or to local level. If there isn't, then community energy is pushing against that trend. And in the UK, local authorities for a very long time haven't really had an awful lot of power to do anything apart from collect the bins or look out for a few local services. So I think it depends really on how the whole regime is working. But I think that what has been seen is maybe community energy as kind of niches where new things can be tried and then potentially rolled out across society more generally. And so policymakers have seen them as opportunities to maybe experiment and try certain things, which can then be replicated in other places. So that's one way of seeing that. But it depends. It's that tension between bottom up and top down, which you can sometimes get, and how much you can kind of legislate for local initiatives, or how much you have to kind of just stand back. But in terms of specific policies, there's no doubt that feed-in tariffs were hugely successful in the UK, largely because they had a separate category of community projects, which were no more than 5 megawatts, for example. And so that led to a huge rise in community energy projects in between 2010 and 2020. And taking them away has made the sector very uncertain, because there's no business model that easily fits and works for that. And then in terms of policies that don't work, I think what's increasingly obvious is that the shift towards auctions, certainly in Germany, for example, there's research which shows that the shift to an auction regime, which doesn't allow a little niche for community energy to survive in it, is just a killer for the sector, because if it's done on the basis of the cheapest possible schemes per megawatt hour, then it's likely that large corporate projects are going to be the cheapest and at scale, because of economies of scale. So, for example, in the Republic of Ireland, they've just brought in their own new auction scheme, but with a separate band for community-led schemes. And so, you're in that kind of terrain of specific policy initiatives that recognize that there's more than one kind of energy project, and that there might be some broader social value in having a small niche within energy transitions for community-led projects to flourish.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because one of the things that's come up here a few times is this idea of a level playing field and not picking winners, right? So there should be a level playing field, and we shouldn't pick winners. And so that's a really interesting comment that certainly applies, I think, down here. We can talk about it in our meeting for sure. So just back to this idea.
Well, really on that level playing field issue, I mean, if it's a level playing field today, then basically what you're saying is that all of the inequalities in the current status quo that have been rising to the surface over decades are going to be continued in the future. I don't think there is a hands-off kind of policy situation. You're either intervening or you're not. And if you say, okay, well, we're going to stand back and just see what happens in the market, then basically you're saying that some people will have much more of an opportunity to participate because they have in the past, and they've got the wherewithal and the knowledge and the skills to do that, and other people won't. And that's fine. If it's a conscious decision and a transparent one, then fine. But if it's not that transparent, then I'm not that sure it's a good idea.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Can you speak a little bit more about the way you see the difference between local energy and community energy, just along the lines of what the differences are? Because here as well, we hear people talking about consumer energy and consumer participation, and not so much about citizen. And I know from our research, there are big differences there.
Yeah. Well, again, these activities tend to overlap, but I guess, I mean, let's take something like, I guess it comes down to whether you see actions in the energy transition space as actions taken by individuals or households, or action taken by collectives of individuals and households and other local actors working together in concert. So it depends on what you see as being community energy, or what you'd like to see driving change in the energy system. If you simply want people to make different choices over which tariff they purchase, or whether they want solar PV on their roofs or not, then you can see a very strong role for consumer-led actions in the energy space. And there's no doubt that there's still a need for that. But as I said, what happens if a whole street wants to put solar PV on their houses at the same time, and they realize that there's benefits in them all doing it at the same time with the same supplier? They can maybe get a good deal on a bulk purchase and put the scaffolding up together. There's benefits of coming together that you just don't get if every household acts separately in its own private self-interest. And that's what begins to happen when you get those more collective community energy initiatives. For example, there are community buildings in most local areas, and they need to be heated, they need to be powered. What about refurbishing them and putting in a new roof with solar PV on at the same time? it's hard to see how households could be involved in that kind of initiative. And it isn't always the case that local authorities have the financial capital to do that. So there's a role for communities coming together potentially and enabling those things to happen. So when I started distinguishing between community energy and local energy last year, it was recognizing that you can have small scale energy initiatives as part of energy transitions, but they're not grassroots initiatives and they're not bottom up initiatives, in the sense that they involve households and trying to reach into society and bring people together in ways that actually lead to tangible energy transition outcomes. Instead, they were, kind of activities that were done to places rather than by places or communities. And in the UK in particular, the most recent vision has really been, okay, energy is an area of innovation. The private sector are the best way of realizing that. How do we enable companies to innovate by doing small scale energy projects to do with electric vehicles, to do with decarbonizing heat, to do with flexibility and variable renewable energy sources. So local energy just means that you don't have enormous power stations anymore. You've got initiatives in the electricity domain, particularly at the low voltage network level, and private companies are at the forefront of that. And local councils are facilitating them to innovate in a local area, and consumers will benefit. So that's that kind of model. But the other model is where local people realize that there's a social need or an environmental need or an economic need, and they try and get it off the ground themselves. Again, maybe enabled by local authorities, but not necessarily dictated to by local authorities or by private companies. And local businesses can be part of that to keep the money locally, but it's just a very different way of doing it. And it prioritizes social outcomes, not just the commercial return or the innovative technologies that might be trialed and then replicated elsewhere by private companies.
Just on a last question is about what some of those kind of social co-benefits might be, and what the challenges are in kind of scaling up. So it's kind of two questions. One, what are the benefits from incentivizing and helping community energy develop? And then what's kind of holding it back if it's not developing? We already spoke briefly about the policy side of things ratcheting back, but I'm sure there are some other challenges.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I started thinking and writing about energy citizenship some time ago, what struck me is that certainly in Western industrialized countries like the UK and Ireland and New Zealand, I think to some degree, we've had a system in place for decades. And it's a system which basically says to the consumer, you just need to pay your bills and we take care of the rest. You flick the switch and electricity comes like magic. No one has any idea where it comes from because it's deliberately distanced from where people actually use energy and need it. So that kind of out of sight, out of mind system is the status quo. That's what we have. Now, if you then introduce the IPCC into this, who talk about the need for a rapid and extensive transformation in the energy systems we have in order to restrict global warming to 1.5 degrees, then you've got an enormous infrastructural technological change process that needs to happen really, really fast. Now, how are you going to manage that if you do not involve society in some way? I mean, if you see technological change as also a social process, or if you think that acceptance or the challenges of implementing this, it's going to be very difficult if you don't bring society with you, then suddenly the conversation shifts, and community energy isn't just another way of putting solar on a village hall, but it's actually part of a societal transformation which needs to happen really fast. And if you leave people and households and communities out of that process of change, then there's a very strong risk, I think, that it will happen slowly. It'll be continually contested. The perpetuation of a system where there's very little trust in utilities or suppliers will actually prevent change happening fast. And in the long run, you just won't get the decarbonization that's needed very, very quickly. That's the risk. So if you see that process of decarbonization as a societal as well as a technological process, then suddenly community energy becomes part of the process of change, and it educates people. As I said, if energy technologies are out of sight, out of mind, then having a local project whether it's energy conservation or renewable energy generation, it starts to make people think about where their energy comes from for the first time. And then maybe they'll use it more carefully. I mean, not necessarily. I mean, there's some evidence that if you've got your own solar PV panel on the roof, you'll think, oh, well, I can do whatever I like now because it's free and I've got my own energy and I'll put everything on. And that isn't necessarily there. So the whole kind of understanding bit, the awareness bit, and hopefully leading to some kind of empowerment bit is something that I think needs to happen, but it won't happen, you know, by accident. And we have to think about society as active players in this process of decarbonization. Or as I said, I'm afraid that the IPCC warnings about the need for rapid change, well, there might be some change, but it might not be rapid, and it might not be really fast enough to really deal with the climate threat.
Yeah, I think that's actually a perfect note to end on. So I really want to thank you for your contribution to our meeting today. And as I said, I'm happy to share with you the results and things like that. If you'd like to see some of the rest of it, I'm sorry you couldn't join us in person. I'm sure a trip to New Zealand would be kind of fun down in the future, but it was really lovely to have you join us today. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. And thank you for inviting me, Julie. Great to speak to you.
Bye-bye
now.
Okay, folks, so that's our first presenter from back in time, you know, a good couple of weeks ago. Our next presenter is actually zooming in from Australia. So Dr. Jarra Hicks, she's the co-founder of the Community Power Agency in Australia. And it's a not-for-profit workers cooperative that supports communities to participate in the renewable energy transition. She's motivated by the power that people are engaging every day to make real contributions to the sustainability of their communities. She's co-founded and worked for a range of community organizations and social enterprises, and her academic work focuses on the potential for community energy. So she's kind of a perfect addition. And I think sometimes when you have speakers from very far away like the UK, it's easy to say, oh, well, it might not work that way here. You know, there's kind of a distancing effect. So having a variety of different experiences of the community energy from across the world, somewhere a little bit closer across the ditch, I think is an incredibly valuable contribution. So welcome, Jarra. Thank you so much for zooming into our meeting this morning. It looks like you're muted at the moment, but just feel free to screen share and take it away.
Hi, everyone. Nice to have that little video so I can get a sense of who I'm speaking with. Lovely to be able to join you today. It's really fantastic that you're coming together in this way. These sorts of forums and events, bringing people together to share knowledge, but also enthusiasm and vision for community energy is definitely something that has helped the sector get up and running in Australia. I say sector, I use that in a fairly liberal way. It's still a very modest undertaking in Australia, but we have come a long way in the past 10 years. And I'm going to share with you today some of our experience. So let me just get the screen up here. Okay, is that working for you all?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I'm going to talk to you about community energy in Australia, and it's a real privilege to follow someone as monumental as Patrick Devine-Wright in this space. His thinking has influenced us very, very much, and so a lot of what I would say is really echoes what he has already spoken about. So I'll go through this first content about what we see community energy as being quite quickly. But so similar to Patrick, we see a role within community energy. It's really important that the community is involved in both the processes and the outcomes of energy projects. And we see it as being projects where the community actively develops and delivers and benefits from a whole range of different types of sustainable energy projects that might be supply sides and involve producing your own renewables through producing your own energy through renewables. They might be demand side projects such as working on energy efficiency or on demand management to help stabilize the grid, for example. Or they might be community-based approaches to selling or sharing energy. And in Australia, we're seeing all three of these kinds of community energy taking off. But I would say at present, most of our projects are renewable energy projects. In terms of scale, they're filling this niche really nicely. In Australia, we've been very successful at getting household level solar PV. So we now have over 2 million solar households in Australia, which just, I think, is evidence that people want to participate in this transition. They're motivated to participate, and where they know how to do it and where it's made easy for them, then they go ahead and do it. So that's working really well. We've got the largest scale renewable energy industry in Australia is doing okay. We've had a very difficult and changeable policy environment that's made it challenging for the large scale developers as well. But they're getting in and also doing some really great projects. And then community energy is really at this scale in between. We generally sort of define it as anything larger than a household scale and smaller than your average commercial scale. So between that sort of 10 kilowatts and 10 megawatts sort of range at present. As Patrick was saying, there's a real diversity of projects that come under this banner of community energy. And although it's diverse, it doesn't mean that we can't still put some bounds on it. And indeed, there is value in trying to put some bounds on it so that it isn't just eroded away into, corporate interest, for example. But in terms of the diversity we're seeing, there's a lot of, I'll speak mostly about, I won't speak to all of the elements on this slide. Julie will make the PowerPoint available to people. So if you want to read more detail afterwards, you can. But just to pick up that in Australia, the actors involved in community energy, they're mostly local people and local businesses or local organisations who are forming a community very much based around a local place. Sometimes that involves local government, but not all the time. More often than not, it doesn't involve local government. But there are also some community energy projects that draw on a community of interest that is more geographically dispersed. We're seeing projects in both urban and rural areas. The urban projects tend to be smaller rooftop projects, whereas in rural areas, there's, I guess, a little bit more opportunity for different kinds of renewable energy projects and maybe some larger projects. In terms of motivations and what's really driving the sector in Australia, it has been very linked to the climate movement. So the first projects were very much driven by a real frustration that our government has been very bad at taking action on climate change, and this has persisted now for more than a decade. And so communities are really, when they take up the idea to set up a community energy project, climate change is a big driver for them. Also, regardless of whether they're concerned about climate change, there's a widespread recognition that we need to move away from coal and gas for the sake of our community's health as well. We've had major events in Australia where, the coal mine fire down in Victoria at Hazelwood was a major issue for that community. And, a recognition that we need to move away from coal and gas. So that's another driving force behind the sector. In terms of the ownership forms, we're seeing most projects in Australia are investment-based projects. So they're led by technically for-profit companies or cooperatives, but they find a way to be social enterprises, to marry the need to maybe pay a small return to their member investors alongside bringing benefit to their local communities and delivering their projects in such a way that a return on investment isn't what motivates them, but at the same time, there's a pragmatic need to raise a lot of money. So we're seeing projects mostly investment-based, but also some led by not-for-profit organisations such as associations and trusts and not-for-profit cooperatives. And then there's a diversity in terms of how they relate to the grid. Some are grid connected and exporting all of the energy. I'd say they are the minority in Australia. At the moment, most projects are behind the meter. So they're in the range of 30 to 100 kilowatts, and they're on the roof of a large energy using building. And I'll talk about the reasons why it's emerged that way in a little bit. So one way we like to think about community energy in terms of just simplifying how we understand what it is, given this diversity of possible project types, and we sort of summarize it in terms of the 4 Ds, in that community energy helps to decarbonize our energy system by using renewable energy or low carbon technologies or increasing efficiency. It helps to decentralize the energy supply and by localizing it, making it relevant in scale to people's daily lives. And it helps to democratize the energy system through actively involving people in decisions around where our energy comes from, and who and what is affected by that. And then the last one is that it demonstrates renewable energy technologies and alternative energy solutions. It gets people believing in the transition, understanding the transition, and more likely to want to be involved. So that's a sort of simple way we like to think about it. So in terms of our progress over here in Australia, in 2009, we had 3 groups who were working towards setting up a community energy project. They didn't have any operational projects yet, and we didn't have any networking or support organisations. And if you jump ahead now, we have 100 groups across all states and territories, and we have 70 operating projects. We also have 2 support organisations, one being the organisation that I work for and co-founded, and the other being a coalition called the Coalition for Community Energy. And I think that that's been a really important piece because it's allowed us to come together as a sector to share knowledge. The Coalition for Community Energy organises a congress every now and then. We wanted to have one this year, but pandemics didn't allow. And that ability to for the peer-to-peer learning, to share resources and experience with each other, and even just to bolster each other in this journey that can be challenging, has been really important. It's also meant that we've been able to build our power as a collective across the country, and it's helped us to lobby for change and policies that we need to support community energy. And we have had some success in that arena, which I'll talk about in a bit. So I've already sort of mentioned quite a few of these in terms of what's helping to drive the development of CORE, which is community-owned renewable energy in Australia. So a lot of the projects that we've seen happen, a vast majority of the projects in Australia are under 100 kilowatts and behind the meter. So they're, as I mentioned before, they're on the roof. A community energy project partners with a large energy user such as a sports club, and they put a system on the roof of the sports club. Part of the reason why this model works here at the moment is because they're able to take advantage of the small scale certificates from our Renewable Energy Target program, which runs out this year. So, and the federal government has not announced a replacement policy or an extension. So the viability of those projects is probably going to change, and I think we'll be seeing if they're still viable. We'll be seeing new kinds of projects emerging, maybe without the presence of that incentive. Other things that have helped to drive the sector are the state-based renewable energy targets. As Patrick mentioned, auctions can be problematic for community energy because they deliver so many different benefits that just being really cheap is not necessarily their strength. So the state-based renewable energy targets in the ACT and Victoria have used an auction process, but they've they've both got a carve out for community energy, so specifically to encourage a portion of that target being met through community energy projects. And it's a question, the Victorian announcement just came out yesterday, so this is something we've lobbied for 3 years, and it's just fantastic that they haven't committed to an amount, but they are looking to do it, which is really, really great. We're hoping that New South Wales and Queensland will follow suit. There has been some state-based support specifically for community energy. We've never had a feed-in tariff for community energy in the country. I think that's a shame because it has been proven to work really well in other countries such as the UK and Germany. But we have had state governments issuing guides, which has been useful in helping support projects to get up and running. They've had grant programs. They're quite ad hoc and small, but they have really kickstarted a lot of projects. And Victoria trialled this idea of the community power hubs, which is something that the Community Power Agency developed based on the type of support that has been really successful in Scotland. So where the model is there's a hub in a community that has a role to support and provide resources and advice and specialty expertise to help community energy projects get off the ground. And that was really very successful in Victoria. The other thing that's starting to happen is private power purchase agreements between community energy projects and organisations that want to support community energy. So universities or the Sydney Opera House, for example, buying the energy produced from community energy projects. And then also the presence of community-owned retailers who part of their reason for existing is to also purchase the energy from community energy projects. So all of those things have really helped the sector establish in Australia. There's still a bunch of barriers. I'm not going to talk through all of these, but I think some of the most challenging barriers in Australia is that we haven't had a stable policy environment to support community energy or even renewable energy in Australia, and that's been at a federal and a state level. And so it's just made it very difficult, and it hasn't enabled us to get beyond the point of always innovating new models. We haven't got to that point where you find something that works and then you roll it out because the context is constantly changing. We also have a highly centralised electricity system and a very volatile energy market, and we've started to see some negative pricing events where, if generators are producing, they actually need to pay to feed their energy into the grid. So those things are making it really difficult, and the market is just so volatile that it's also very hard to predict where it's going to be in 12 months' time. So I've got a lot of content in here now about the different models that have emerged in Australia, and I'm not going to speak to all of these because there's not a lot of, I don't have enough time. How many minutes to go there, Julie? I'll just keep on because I didn't hear a response. I hope you can still hear me. But if you are interested in the different models, please do have a look at this. And all of the logos that are on each slide, they're all the different projects that are doing this model. So if you're interested in it, you can go and find information on that particular model. I'll just quickly say that the bulk buying, so bringing people together to bulk purchase solar panels, batteries, solar hot water, and now electric vehicles is something that's been really popular and really successful in Australia. And it's installed hundreds of megawatts of energy and has, although it's individual households getting an energy system, it still has that collective element. And the collective element, it usually involves an education and energy efficiency component to the project as well. So that it's been a really great place to start for new projects as well. It's not quite as complicated and difficult, and not as long, not as the development pathway isn't as long as developing, you know, a solar farm, for example. So a lot of projects in Australia start with something like this and then move on to something else. So I'll just flick through these. I'll just mention quickly, we do have 2 community-owned energy retailers in Australia, which is has been a really great addition to the landscape, because all of the other retailers are, you know, corporate, and majority of them are private companies. They're not state-owned anymore. Queensland is an exception. But. So I think I'll just talk quickly now about what I see as the unique role and importance of community energy in the transition to renewable energy. I think the question now is not whether we'll transition to renewable energy. It's about how that transition happens, how fast it happens, and who participates and who gets to benefit from that process. And I think that community energy has a really important role to play, as Patrick was saying, in building the social context of support that will drive the transition, that will drive the type of policy and the type of politics we need to embrace renewable energy. But it will also drive a range of social outcomes that will mean that this transition to renewable energy is not only well received by our communities, but it helps us to create a better society. And particularly in Australia, it's got a massive opportunity for regional Australia. There's a lot of issues here with regional communities, you know, like the youth moving away, and regional communities struggling to maintain their population and their livelihoods. And so energy is obviously a massive opportunity there. Renewable energy is a massive opportunity there. But if big corporates come in and do projects, the economic benefits and the social benefits to local communities are not the same. They're nowhere near as beneficial as if communities do those projects themselves and own those projects themselves. So I think in Australia, we've had quite a lot of backlash to some large-scale development, and I think there's a lot of reasons for this. Yeah, I don't have time to maybe dwell on that right now, but I think community energy has a real important role to play at building the social license for renewables at a project level and also at a meta level. And at a project level, we see that community energy projects integrate the technology into communities in a way that enables them to participate and to benefit. And that leads to active levels of support for not only that project, but for renewable energy and for the transition more broadly. And we've seen this playing out in very clear ways in Australia so far. And so that though all of those people, all of those energy citizens involved in projects across the country then become more aware of and more interested in, for example, energy politics and energy policies, and actually getting involved in that process and helping to win the types of policies we need to support community energy and renewables. And that has happened many times over in Australia so far. So I think that that's a really, really valuable role that community energy can play. Community energy, I think, also helps us to make sure that this transition is an opportunity for us to decentralise and democratise our energy system. And in Australia, at least, our energy system has been dominated by very large corporations that are climate criminals for a very long time. And so being able to change that system and being involved in that change is really, really important. We have communities who have traditionally relied on coal extraction and on gas, realising that change needs to happen and getting involved in community energy projects because they see it as a positive way for their communities to engage in this transition instead of seeing the transition as a threat. So that's been, I think that's a really exciting and important aspect of community energy. I won't speak to all of this, but I think, as Patrick was saying, the range of benefits from community energy projects goes beyond what you can get from a corporate project. So, you know, all renewable energy projects deliver environmental benefits and some technological benefits, but there's a range of social and political and local economic benefits that come particularly with community energy. And yeah, that's really makes it unique. I think I need to wrap up. So great, this is my last slide. Opportunities and trends going forward. You will be hearing later today from one of our federal MPs, Helen Haynes. We've been working with her and she's been doing a great job of developing a proposal for a local power plan. We've gotten very close to having a federal community energy program for a few years, but then the wrong people get elected. Oh, well, the people who support the policy don't get elected. So it'd be great if we could develop a comprehensive national support program for community energy. I think the energy and enthusiasm and will to participate is there. If given a stable and supportive environment, I think we'd see a real proliferation of community energy in Australia. One of the issues has been the social equity aspect of the renewable energy transition. So, you know, households who can afford it are taking up solar because it makes financial sense. But what about the people who can't afford the upfront cost, or the people who rent or live in apartments, or, you know, aren't able to access that benefit? So we've been trying to innovate a variation on the solar garden model, which has been hugely successful in the US, and where our first solar garden, called the Haystack Solar Garden, is now open for members. So we're really excited about that. It doesn't answer all of the issues to do with social equity because it's still got a high buy-in price, but it does enable renters and apartment owners to own solar and participate in the benefits of solar PV. So that's a great next step. First Nations community energy has been not something that's been happening very much yet in Australia, but it is building momentum, and there's organisations now like Aotearoa starting to emerge. So that's a space that we're really hoping. Actually, I think we have a lot to learn from you. So I'm interested to hear how things are going in New Zealand in this way, and maybe we can share some of the knowledge back here. I think a big thing that's changing in the Australian space at the moment is we're seeing mid-scale projects sort of in that 1 to 10 megawatt range really starting to make sense. They make sense on lots of different levels, and one of those is that they can integrate into our current electricity network and have a range of benefits by feeding into the distribution network rather than the transmission network. And if paired with batteries and some demand, like smart demand management, that can play a really important role in helping to stabilise the grid. So we're seeing a lot of interest in mid-scale projects, and we've got, I think, 4 around 1 megawatt community solar farms likely to come online in the next year, which is really fantastic. The other model that's gaining a lot of momentum is this whole of community approach. So whole communities working together, forming a whole diverse range of partnerships locally, you know, with local government, local businesses and organisations and households, all working together to become 100% renewable or zero net energy or zero net emissions, which is a really exciting and a much bigger project than just a community energy project, but has really been gaining momentum here. And I think we'll see some exciting movement in that space over the next few years. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you. I'm sorry.
That's wonderful. Thanks very much. So there were some questions that were in the chat. So Jarra, if you'd like to kind of join in and answer any of those. And we won't have time for kind of Q&A with the room, but as I said before, if you in the room have questions for Jarra or Chris, you can stick them up on the stickies, or you can go online into the Zoom and put them in there. They can communicate them after. We really are hoping for longer term kind of connections to be built today, so this isn't your only chance to engage, basically. So our next speaker today is Chris Henderson, and he is from my home country of Canada. And he's a preeminent clean energy advisor to Indigenous communities. And I'm really excited to have Chris's wisdom with us here in the room, because in the Aotearoa New Zealand context, the issue of treaty rights, treaty sovereignty, and treaty partnerships, and how that fits in, if it does, with any sort of energy transition is absolutely essential. So there are lots, I think, other people can learn from New Zealand, but also I think there's a lot that we can be looking to in other countries to see how Indigenous environmental justice and energy justice can play a leading role and not just kind of a tack on at the end. And so I think it's really exciting to have him speaking for us today. And so yeah, I sent around his bio, but he advises chiefs and councils, tribal groups, Indigenous economic development corporations. He's part of Indigenous Clean Energy Canada, which, if you haven't checked out their website, has a massive range of different projects that are happening across Canada. So welcome, Chris. We're really keen to hear what is going on the other side of the world again.
Thanks very much, Julie. And I imagine you're into your spring, summer, and I'm into the start of our winter. And I'm looking out my window, and we've got about 2 feet of snow here, but maybe a cold day. But I'm coming to you with my warm heart of Canada. What I'd like to do today is to share a bit with you in terms of how Indigenous communities have moved forward with community power in Canada. And I'm going to be relatively short. I'm going to take about 5-10 minutes, and then really want to go as interactive with you as much as possible. And to your point, Julie, very much look forward to the collaboration that's ongoing, and I'll talk to you, in fact, how we're set up to engage with that. So I'm going to share my screen and hope that it all works through. So we'll do that. Can you see that, Julie?
Yeah, working great.
Perfect. Great. This is part of a great journey about decolonialization. For the last 350 years in Canada, we have had a colonial political system that removed the rights of Indigenous people, destroyed cultures, destroyed health, and destroyed livelihoods. And you know what? The energy system of Canada, and frankly, for good parts of the world, are similarly colonialized. They're owned by large companies or run by large public or state utilities or private utilities, large technology firms, and they're controlled by governments. And so really what we want to try and do moving forward is to see how we can accelerate transition to a clean energy future that truly reflects a just transition. And Julie, one of the things we'll share with you is I'll send you a more detailed report called Accelerating Transition, which we recently produced, that talks about the transition we're going through in Canada. And in that introduction, we talk to a need for a just transition that's just transition about dealing with climate futures, a just transition in terms of clean energy, but fundamentally all a just transition to democracy of power, sharing of power, collaborative power. And that's where Indigenous communities in Canada are today, and in fact have been for about 2 decades, and increasingly so. One of the books I really love is written by an author called Robin Wall Kimmerer, an Indigenous woman in the United States, an academic, who wrote a book called Braiding Sweetgrass. Do get it, it's absolutely marvelous. And she talks about how her stories are weaving together these 3 strands of Indigenous ways of knowing scientific knowledge, and her story as an Indigenous scientist. And we think that similar approach, or braiding sweetgrass, braiding the sweetgrass of energy and sweetgrass of those who don't know, has particular cultural significance to Indigenous communities in North America. So can we braid a new sweetgrass, a new form of strands that we come together that has many benefits that truly reflect the just transition that we're seeing? In Canada, the way we've approached this with Indigenous clean energy is we approach this as a spectrum of opportunities. And so for the last 2 or 3 decades, many communities have embarked upon renewable energy projects, which I'm going to come back to in some detail. and with some very significant impacts across the country. But in addition, we look at the future of clean energy as being a four-sided spectrum. 4 directions of the map, 4 directions of change, four types of wind. So you've got renewable energy projects for sure, but you've also got energy efficiency and conservation of housing, of infrastructure, which is really a big contributor to the health and livelihoods of Indigenous communities. But frankly, we're a cold country in the Arctic. We consume a lot of power. It costs a lot of money. It has a lot of impact. So we can consume less power. We can have megawatts, the better off we are. And a community energy efficiency housing project may be as big, if not bigger, than a renewable energy project. And then we also see clean energy infrastructure projects, things like that are getting into transmission, that are getting into district energy. And we're looking at advanced energy infrastructure, looking at smart grids and things like that. So over the last couple of decades, Indigenous communities across Canada have done just that. And Indigenous Clean Energy Canada, or Indigenous Clean Energy Social Enterprise, is the national hub for this. And you can go and look at more information, but we have a series of programs that have promoted that Indigenous clean energy participation. So where are we? Where have we gone to? Here are the numbers. So before you look at these numbers, I'll give you another number that kind of may be a bit earth-shattering. Indigenous communities in Canada own or co-own 18% of the generation of electricity in the country. So almost 1/5 of every electron produced in Canada is owned through a generating project or potentially a generating and transmission project that's owned, co-owned with an Indigenous community and often a partner, a development company or a utility or another enterprise. And here's what these numbers look like. So there are almost 200 medium to large renewable energy projects. So these are projects between 1 megawatt in size to as high as 4,000 megawatts in size. So that's certainly well beyond community power, but I'll come back to the community of this and what it means. But you also have around 2,000 renewable energy projects, typically around 500 kilowatts to 1 megawatt in size, that are smaller renewable energy projects, mostly solar, that are owned by communities in large measure, sometimes with partners. In our country, we're also reliant on energy for heat. And so bioenergy projects that both convert biomass into heat, but also into power are growing. And a couple of years ago, we did this project. There were only 10 bioenergy projects, community scale bioenergy projects. Now there are 72. And some of these projects are smaller. They may be generating the equivalent of 100 or 300 kilowatts worth of power. Some of them are as high as 10 megawatts of power, where it ties into our forest product industry, where you're using waste wood and slash to generate heat or power that's used in the community or also sold to the market. And then finally, we have 19 major transmission projects. And these are large-scale projects. These are not small interconnection projects. These are projects that are in the range of, these are large 230 kilowatt projects that would have KV projects that would have anywhere from 300 million to $1 billion worth of expenditure. And I'll give you an example. In Northern Ontario, the state that I live in, there are 23 Indigenous communities that are remote, not connected to the grid. They're 100 kilometers from a road, 100 kilometers from a transmission site, transmission access. So as a result, they're building transmission access to those communities. That is going to be owned by the community, but it's a large-scale transmission project. It's going to be $1.3 billion. The actual value of that is actually more than the reliance they have on diesel energy for heat and power, sometimes of which is driven in over ice road over hundreds of kilometers or barged in across the whole North Atlantic and into Hudson's Bay, and sometimes even flown in. So transmission projects can be large trunk projects that are bringing renewable energy to market, or they could be small connected projects, which are also large because they deal with community needs. And finally, there are about 127 community scale energy efficiency projects. So those in sum represent the community interest. So how are these projects owned? The Indigenous community interest or community ownership, so they could be through a private enterprise, but the community ownership is communally owned, and the benefits is shared in the community. And those are used for long-term economic development, for social needs, for infrastructure, for healthcare, for education, and things like that. And so what we see now in Canada is around $300 million a year in net earnings that Indigenous communities are earning from these projects, which they are channeling into sustainable livelihoods, sustainable communities. And therein lies the community power of this. This is the power of change. So Indigenous communities in Canada are not only generating power in their own communities, like the smaller renewable energy projects, or the bioenergy projects in part, or the energy efficiency projects that are reducing energy demand and reliance on fossil fuels. But they're also generating large projects and that they are co-owners of, that are using to generate community ownership for community benefit. So this to us is part of the democratizing of energy that we really need, in contrast to the colonial reality of energy of the past and today. Finally, I'll leave Julie, you and your colleagues with this, is that we also see time for global community energy collaboration. So we would be delighted to share any stories with you, and I'll send you this deck, Julie, you can send it to everybody. You'll see a bunch of contact information. We have an Indigenous Clean Energy Network, the ICE network at icenet.work. There are over 1,100 people on it. We have collabs every day. In fact, my colleague Freddie Campbell hosted a collab this afternoon on how we're coping about clean energy in a time of COVID. How are we keeping projects going when we have to protect against transmission of the virus? We have sometimes up to 200 or 300 people on our webinars in a month, and everyone in this meeting and anyone you know is invited. There's no charge. It's a way to promote global energy collaboration. And the icon you see in front of you is one thing that we've started that we think has real relevance for global cooperation and climate action. We started something called 3 Island Energy, or TIE. And Freddie Gamble, my colleague, will make sure you have all the coordinates, because you can join the TIE forum that we have on the ICE network. And we have a webinar coming up in a couple of weeks on community energy projects. What TIE is a sharing between 3 kinds of islanded communities. We class these as Indigenous islands of culture, Indigenous communities, island and coastal communities that are very reliant on the energy and often don't have good energy access, and often are going to be disproportionately affected by climate change, as will Indigenous communities be. And finally, unelectrified communities mean if you're in the Kibera slum in the middle of Nairobi, where 1 million people live every day, they have no grid access at all. They need access to energy, and we think that access to small community microgrids is part of the solution. And we're bringing this into the climate change process, and we expect to have a major gathering at the time of the conference parties meeting in Glasgow next fall. So that's the story, Julie. I'd be pleased to answer questions. I wouldn't say there aren't challenges. Jarra, you were very honest to say there are challenges here. There are lots of challenges. But what we've got is a bit of a force of a community coming together with a lot of political influence, both at the national level, the state level. And while we don't always have the right signals that we need from regulators, from energy markets, from pricing, from contracting, the scale of the strength of Indigenous communities in the sector and the need for Indigenous rights to be governed and to take forward the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, we've made some progress. There's more to go, particularly in areas like energy efficiency and conservation, microgrids, and also advanced energy infrastructure. That's our story. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm sure there are quite a few questions, and as you said, so the PowerPoint slides are slightly minimized, so it would be really helpful if you'd email those through. And for all of our attendees online and in the room, we'll share the PowerPoint slides, so we'll send you a link to where you can find the PowerPoint slides and the speaker bios and contact information. So we're going to move on actually to our next speaker, but as I said, if you have specific questions for Chris or any of the other speakers, you can use the Zoom chat function, or you can put some questions up on the side there, and we'll make sure that you get connected and we get them answered, and particularly in our big discussion section at the end of the day. That's where we'll be pulling all of these things together. So we're going to move on to our last speaker of this International Insights panel. You may have also seen that for those in the room, there's some tea at the back. So this next speaker is another kind of 20-minute pre-recorded video segment. So if you need to stretch a little bit and you need to get some tea and some refreshments, you're more than welcome to as well. So our next speaker is Ashi Rashid. And she's the co-founder and CEO of Repowering London. She's also the chair of the Brixton Energy Cooperative and Brixton Solar. So this was the UK's first inner-city community-owned solar power station. She's also the chair of Community Energy England. So much like Jarra and Jarra's organization in Australia is playing this kind of networking and support and movement building work, in the UK, Afsheen's organization is doing something similar. So she's also been involved, actually I do the intro, I do the intro in the video, so you'll hear all of this again. So just give me 2 seconds and I'll screen share a video of an interview with Ashi Rashid. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on the panel. So I'm pre-recording this interview with Ashi Rashid, who's the co-founder and CEO of Repowering London and the chair of the Brixton Energy Solar Cooperative in the UK. And it's the UK's first inner-city community-owned power station. She's also chair of Community Energy England, and she's influential in local and national community energy decision-making in the UK. And prior to Repowering's foundation, she pioneered the Lambeth Council's Community Energy Programme and was a senior policy advisor at the Department of Energy and Climate Change in the UK, and instrumental in setting up the Muslim Women's Collective in Tower Hamlets, so seeking to empower women. So I'm just so delighted that Afsheen's joining us on the panel because she's got such a wealth of policy experience as well as kind of that direct project experience. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're delighted. So the first question I have for you is, how would you characterize community energy? What is it and what drove its emergence in the UK?
What is it? So in really simple terms, community energy can be a group of individuals living on a street or a community neighborhood wanting to establish a project to put solar panels on their school or a community building, or it may be a group of people wanting to reduce their energy demand, some people running a cafe or energy advice workshop to help people reduce their energy bills. And that's been more the traditional kind of look and feel of community energy. But more recently, it's been getting into a more innovative space of looking at supplying electricity locally, about flexibility service, battery storage, transport, heat. So it's really expanding. So community energy is what you would like to make it in your local area, to build that net zero or low carbon future that we all want to see. And it's been interesting, the growth of community energy, and a lot of people who are familiar in the UK. There was, 10 years ago, I think in 2010, when the government introduced the subsidy for generating renewable electricity, and it was called the feed-in tariff. That was a key driver, motivator for a lot of community groups to come together because they saw a route to creating an income stream, a viable, project model that could work. Now, obviously, the feed-in tariff was not introduced for community energy specifically. It was obviously introduced for the wider marketplace. But another thing that was happening while the FIT was introduced was tax relief was also introduced at the time for green investments. This combined with, there was this, at the time, of financial constraint and recession, there was a huge movement to people taking back control. And there was a huge movement around cooperatives growing and expanding in the UK, and community-based approaches. And so it was a combination of these three, factors that were independent, not, specific for community energy, that then led to lots of organizations setting up and coming together and community taking action in their areas. And we've got community energy. 10 years on, we are thriving, doing well.
Yeah, that's so wonderful. So about the tax relief, how did that work? Just a little bit, so people here can get a sense of what that might look like, what some of those designs are.
So with the community energy schemes, one of the key aspects of it is about raising capital finance. So say you want to install solar panels, it has a cost. And we're able to raise that capital finance through what is called community shares. So it's these shares are not standard stock and market kind of base shares, but they are community shares where people can buy and invest in a co-op. And one member buys one share. It's democratic principles. Yeah. Now, with the tax relief, it allowed people to invest in these schemes, and they were able to claim tax off their investments. So, and it was really a very strong incentive. When it started off, I think if you invested £10,000, it was 50% tax relief, tax deductible on that investment.
Then it got reduced later on, and it was 30%, and then there was caps brought into it. So they became a bit more sophisticated with how it was administered and the benefits. But it did what was intended, was to help de-risk a market for a new technology and allow for the growth of green investments.
Yeah.
So
and was it specifically targeted for communities then, right? It wasn't just open to any investment in renewables?
No, it was open. It was a lot wider. Green investments, not specifically for community energy. So that's why I said somehow all of these different policies that emerged at a similar time, we sat in between them, and community energy kind of benefited from that. But of course, we can come further down in our discussions and talk about, the challenges, these support mechanisms have obviously been removed over time.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So what role has Community Energy England played? So as these policy developments were taking place, in either pushing for new policies or in mobilizing the sector, what is the role? What has it been?
So Community Energy England is a member-based organization. If you like, we are a trade body representing the voice of the sector, and we're engaging government, industry, and raising awareness of community energy. Key aspect of our work has been around, and still is very much on, advocacy and influence, responding to consultations, to lobbying governments on key asks that would help the sector thrive. What is really important is the energy industry as a whole, is going through a lot of change, and over the last few years, it's been really choppy. Measures have come in, been taken away. So Community Energy England has played a real key role in advocating for strong policy to enable community energy groups to thrive and grow. But other aspects of Community Energy England's role has also been around connecting and collaborating, so running events, conferences, sharing that learning best practice amongst existing groups, so we're not constantly reinventing the wheel. So there's an element of that cascading, but also amplifying the voice and saying, hey, this is what we're doing. So there's a lot of gathering data and information, and really demonstrating our impact with evidence. So every year, for instance, Community Energy England publishes a state of the sector report. And, do have a look on the website. So we've got a report on an annual basis. We say, look, last year, this is what happened. And cumulatively, we can see that community energy groups have grown across the UK. We're like 300 right now. Our impact in terms of kilowatts installed has increased significantly. So we're at, across the UK, 250 megawatts of installed capacity. What's really, great about these data is that we can show that jobs have been created, more than 260 odd jobs created in the sector, our members, our reach. So it's a three-pronged, effect. You gather the data, you inform, you provide the evidence to influence the policy, and then you share best practice amongst each other in case studies, toolkits, so that we can see further growth.
Yeah. And how was that resource? So when you were getting up and running, when this first developed, I'm just thinking about building that kind of system and what that would look like. Where does the funding come from, especially when members are new and starting?
Yes. It's been a journey of growth for Community Energy England. Initially, it was largely volunteer-led, directors putting in time, to moving to a funding model where members who are able to pay can pay. So we've got quite a fair membership model, and building on that, we also have been able to attract funding from grant funders and trusts and organizations who understand the value that Community Energy England provides, and that community energy as a sector has and plays that important role in the energy transition. And it's thanks to those collaborations and partnerships that we've been able to find the finance and funding for Community Energy England to grow. And now, it's got a team of five members of staff. Still a small organization, but very, very impactful.
Yeah, the reports are incredible, and I know how much work goes into them, so that's why I was asking. So the next question I have for you is about the differences in community energy groups that you're seeing in your work. So what are some of the different types of communities and the diversity in communities participating? And I'm particularly interested in the benefits that arise from having diversity in the sector rather than one kind of community represented.
I think the beauty about community energy is that there is no fixed model or stereotype. There was, at the start of community energy, this view, obviously, community energy is only seen in rural communities, and a very typical kind of engaged individual, white middle class people can only benefit and participate. What I've been able to do with my organization at Repowering, which is Repowering London, we're based in London, in Brixton in particular. We were the first community energy group to establish a project in an inner city context, urban context, with real diverse communities. And we kind of shifted the norm and said, no, this is not only about people who have money to invest and have the ability to participate. It is also about an inclusive model of bringing people who might not be able to own their homes or have the money to invest, but can still benefit from these cooperative models through membership and having a voice. Through the money that gets generated through these projects can be ring-fenced for community benefit, so that people who aren't able to invest can still benefit from it. And for example, like running training programs, running fuel poverty kind of advice workshops, money saving workshops in the community, solar panel making workshops. They're very, very popular. Yeah. So it's really that, I think the beauty about community energy is that diversity. Communities that might be rural or urban communities that might be coming together as, out of a shared interest, to those with maybe a very, very small focus that they only want to work in their locality, whereas some have ambitions to do regional projects and larger scale projects. So you've got that whole range, and the beauty about that is that it really creates local solutions that are relevant to that local context, and it creates that diversity of thinking, diversity of approaches, innovation, not just technical innovation, but also social innovation in the kind of way that you can structure and work through, a project design. So I say, that diversity is underpinned by a certain kind of set of principles and values. So where the cooperatives come from is really embedding that cooperative value. It's people-led, it's inclusive, it's about building trust in longer-term relationships, and that participatory governance, so the members have a voice in how money gets distributed, what projects go forward. And it's also about a whole system approach. So we're not just, when we go into a community, and I'm sharing my experience of working at Repowering, it's not just thinking about the energy, we've got to put solar panels on this roof, or we've got to install battery. It's about really thinking about the people that we're working with and looking at opportunities in which we can provide more services. So we do a lot of advice in terms of energy efficiency, switching energy suppliers, giving advice to how you can retrofit your homes, to ensuring that the people in the blocks can benefit from the schemes directly, and looking at other impacts and partnering with local agencies who can help in financial benefits advice, grant advice. So really taking a holistic approach to our engagement.
Yeah, and how have you found the reception from the people in those communities? Has it been high? Has it been tough?
It's been, you have to really put in, you have to keep engaging. As a local organization, that presence and that relationship needs to be fed and nurtured. So if due to whatever resources or other time commitments, if you shift away and shift your focus, then you're going to miss that contact and that reach. So that what is beautiful about community energy projects and is really about that locally rooted approach. And one of our experiences at Repowering has been recruiting and employing local champions. So that even as an organization, if we're expanding our work and trying to support other community energy groups to learn from our experience, and we've been mentoring other groups across London to do the same, what we're also doing is investing in our local area, making sure that people are locally employed and can maintain those local connections and values. So yes, then you see a really good response and take up of services and support. And I must say, during the coronavirus crisis, it's our local champions that shaped our response, and our local was promoted to those who needed it the most. So it really showed value of that community-led approach. It really made us as an organization very relevant, and our work really relevant at a very critical time.
Yeah, oh, that's wonderful. So one of the questions I had as well was about after the FIT was reduced, and one of our other speakers on the panel has talked about that a bit, the post-FIT environment. What kinds of projects are happening? What kinds of opportunities that aren't just about, I'd say, the power generation side of things?
I must say it is a challenging market to work in. You know, there's constantly chop and change and movement happening. The industry as a whole is going through a lot of change, and you know we're trying to weave our way through. But community energy projects have been here before, as I said. You know, we've had the feed-in tariff significantly been reduced over the years. We've had the tax relief, mechanism that was introduced early on, which was then again taken away. Planning has become more challenging. But on this, at the back of that, what we have shown over the last 10 years that we've been growing is that we have resilience, and that we're constantly innovating. We're innovating and finding what else can we do. So there are community energy groups that are still developing rooftop solar, ground mount projects. We're installing solar panels with a post-FIT without any FIT and subsidy, and they stack up. It's about making it scalable. And I think we have to be a bit more selective right now to make, site specific, because we don't have the subsidy. Some projects would need some subsidy or grants to enable it to happen. But if you're looking at scale, and that's where most people are going, if you achieve scale, then the project economics can work, because we've seen prices of solar panels go down. But it's still kind of a shifting market, and we're still looking at ways in which we can develop and make more projects stack up in a post-subsidy world. But there are groups that are able to achieve this. I think what's also really working is the collaboration and finding the right partners to help you develop your projects. People are also looking at diversifying income streams. So, while the FIT was a major driver back in the day, over the few years, we've been shifting and looking at other income streams. So selling electricity is quite key to these models and making them work, and fixing the right price for selling your electricity is very important as well. So you size your system so that you can sell most of it on site. So that's been a shift in focus. And in terms of what community energy groups are engaged in is really around innovation in developing new business models for not just rooftop solar, ground mount solar, but also innovation in terms of some of the other exciting areas of local electricity supply, flexibility services, so being able to sell services back to the grid. Some groups are engaged in transport, low carbon transport schemes, electric vehicle charging. Some are involved in heat projects, and so there's a whole range of new areas of development, which everyone's quite focused in.
Yeah, thanks. One of the things I've heard is there's some interest in identifying what the barriers for community energy it's going to be different in all of the different areas you listed, but I think sometimes from a policy perspective, policymakers maybe think, well, if communities want to, they can participate. This is a kind of a free and open competition. So what are the actual barriers to them just doing it like any other company? So I'm kind of curious to hear your experience of that, because it justifies then any sort of policy intervention if there are actual barriers.
I think the approach which community energy groups take make it more intensive in terms of the setup costs, the development costs. It's about bringing people on board in a journey. It's not like we're doing things to people, all right, okay, you can find a roof and install the solar panels on it, but what is the added value and the benefit? How many people have you brought on that journey? We know that there have been huge amounts of investments in retrofits and for buildings, but if you don't change people's behavior and if you don't engage the person in the building, then that's a lot of that money going out of the window. So it's really the challenge and barriers for community energy is access to development finance, early stage development finance to help make the models work, to go through our engagement participation mechanisms. But also, I think with, in community energy, particularly in the UK, the growth has been largely volunteer-led. So there's been a shift to professionalizing the sector. And I'm very proud to say that, the sector has professionalized. There is still quite a lot of groups that are working on a voluntary basis, but being able to pay for services, pay for people's roles and times to develop projects is essential as well. There are other barriers in terms of finding site owners and getting partners on board, because there is this element where, if you come across as a community group, then they're like, oh, you're really small, why should we engage with you? You're not going to really do much for me in terms of a partner to collaborate with. But if you come across really business-like and professional, then they're like, well, if you can make it work and you're going to make profit on it, so how can I, why should I work with you when I might as well just, kind of copy your business model and do it myself? So it's a very fine balance and act to play, because we are representing communities, but equally we have to make these business models stack up financially. So those are some of the challenges in terms of perception, building partnerships, accessing finance, and then of course the regulatory change is challenging as well. So as I mentioned, with having the feed-in tariff and then constantly having it changed and chopped, it affects any business, let alone community energy. So that kind of constant having to work towards deadlines that are unrealistic, or having a constantly changing boundaries and scope is challenging. And I suppose as community organizations, you need a bit more of support to help give you that level playing field with the other players in the market.
So my last question for you is, do you think community energy is now here to stay as an integral part of the energy transition? I mean, it's tough, I understand, but is it small? Is it growing? Is it retracting? What role do you see it playing in the future?
Well, as I said, it is growing despite the challenges, and I don't want to undermine the challenges, but I come at it from a real positive point of view. And more importantly, we face a climate crisis. And in that context, if we are to achieve the targets that we're setting ourselves in the UK for a net zero by 2050, we have a huge challenge ahead of us. And that change, we're going to have to change the way we operate, the way we make decisions, the way we run businesses, and the way we make choices as individuals and as a collective society. And to do that and to achieve that, we need to bring people on this journey with us. And community energy plays that key role in empowering people to build their zero carbon future. So I think community energy is definitely here to stay and to grow.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining us today.
Great. Thank you very much.